This is the Politics of Doom for March 14th, Monday. Um, Holly Byer should have presented Chapter 6, and you should have had a discussion on that. And that's where I want to leap off from that chapter for my remarks tonight, which I take about 15 minutes, and then you can watch Contagion. So you should have the notes in front of you, which I will have passed out this afternoon. In Chapter 6 of Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe, Ferguson recounts how politics has caused or exacerbated the most harrowing famines of history. And one of the selections for the readings in this course, which I dropped because I lost my book, but let me recommend it, is Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, which accounts how the death of 30 million human beings between 1930 and 1945 from Poland to Moscow, including, of course, the Nazi horrors and the Stalinist purges, but then also several harrowing chapters on the Ukrainian and Russian and Soviet famine of 1932, etc. Um, and and as I mentioned in my notes here, Snyder suggests that the number of people who perished in the famines, Ferguson says 4 to 5 million, and we're probably more like 9 to 15 million. So just note that. And then, of course, the astounding thing that comes out of that chapter is the most horrific famine in history was the People's Republic of China in 1959. What the low target in that chart, he says, is 40 million. The high is 60 million, with the best around 45 million people. Most probably Americans are utterly unaware of that event within the last 70 years. But anyway, he also then raises the question of the slippery distinction between natural and man-made disasters, and discussing World War II and the death tolls and the terrible battle disasters of World War II, one and two for that matter. With a look, by the way, in the section on famine, back to the Dust Bowl of the United States, which many of you may or may not have been aware of, and what a disaster that was. And again, what a slippery issue that is in terms of a man-made or a natural disaster. But the chapter ends with an interesting reflection on what kills empires and nations. And he goes to the death of the Roman Empire, the Ming Dynasty, the Ottoman Empire, the Soviet Union. And so that made me think. Now, I have to say this is based on a lecture I gave in Princeton in 2008, but I reformulated it for this class. So I wanted to take off from his last suggestion, because typically we're discussing how politics causes, mitigates, or exacerbates disasters. But in some ways, the question is as well, how might disaster overtake the political system? What kills political systems? So that's I want to raise the question of how might our what might kill the United States of America? Um, uh, how might our political system die? And I start off with a reflection, by the way, like Ferguson does in Chapter 1 on death, human death, mortality, the meaning of mortality in our lives. And I want to ask the question in particular why we need to think about death in connection with politics. Why is that a natural connection? Not just because we're all going to die, but what does the death of a political system mean? And as Ferguson reflects on death in the opening chapter of 1, what gives meaning to our lives? Religion, and here I quote from Beethoven's, the fourth movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Brüder überm Sternenzelt muss ein lieber Vater wohnen. Oh, brothers, over the starry canopy must a loving father dwell. Um, uh, and to some degree, you could say for the religious person, belief in God is the primary consolation in the face of death. To quote from Paul in Corinthians, "O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory?" But people just don't look to belief in God because of the fear of coming to an end, of dying, and hoping for something beyond the grave, although that might be a primary motivation as to why people believe in God and hope for life after death. It also has to do with the incompleteness of justice in this world. Um, um, like the book of Job. And to some degree, when I suggest that's also why politics is important to us, because we observe that this, because of natural chance, disaster, the wickedness of human beings, whatever, that life can be radically unfair and unjust here, either because of chance or because of wickedness. And therefore, the same reason that we hope for life after death, that we hope for the completion of the injustice or the rectification of the injustice we see in this life, um, that's also ultimately why we look to the political system to some degree. I understand that may seem bizarre, but if you think of every nation as a little island of a human imitation of divine power in the world, and that oftentimes, if there is no God, and here's where the believer and the atheist can, as I suggest, can join hands, the political system might provide some of the rectification of the injustice we see in the world. At least that's what we hope in criminal trials and by holding people account for their actions. Now, obviously, politics is flawed, and it would be a vast illusion to think that human beings, in their imperfection, could match the hope for rectification of injustice that we experience in our belief of God. But nevertheless, that's to some degree what what bears our hopes for the political system, even if we think our political system stinks. Nevertheless, oftentimes, even in the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, the political system, as much injustice as it unleashed, was also in the only sense of correction of injustice. So if you, even in Harry Potter, by the way, if you notice at the end of the Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, when Lupin and Tonks and the Resurrection Stone at the end, when Harry says, "I'm sorry that you died for me," and Lupin says, uh, "Explain it to our son; he'll know what we died for," meaning that they died to prevent the injustice of Voldemort. So we all assume that we're going to die, but we have a tendency to presume the immortality of our political system, even while it's short-lived, like the Third Reich, which only lived actually about 15 years. Um, uh, but but obviously, are regimes or countries doomed to die? And here there are two answers to this. Aristotle says yes, because everything's doomed to die in this world. Therefore, there's no such thing as an eternal political system. Madison, as in James Madison and the founders, thought that perhaps if you designed a system correctly enough, it would last forever. But let's presume that Aristotle may have the upper hand here, and that the likelihood that the United States is going to come to an end someday, is something we should think about. So, on one level, that's the question I'm going to raise. What might lead to the death of the United States? So, first, a reflection on what the political system is. And I teach this in American government in my political theory classes. That the regime is, or the constitution of a nation, its political identity, its comprehensive political system, has four elements: a certain set of shared ideas, in this case, the Declaration of Independence for us, institutions that kind of structure the power and institutional processes of the society, like the Constitution, uh, policies and laws, which are the actions of the political system through time and space, and a certain citizen character and culture of life, which is the habits and way of life of the humans that become the concrete examples of its principles. Now, of course, no nation can embody its principles completely. No human being, even a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or whatever, can simply be the things you believe in, because we have a tendency to fail to embody our beliefs. And that's true of nations too. Nevertheless, you could say there's an American identity. And regimes change, by the way. And not only, as Ferguson traces in chapter 6, you could say the British Empire ended in 1945, where it was a gradual process of kind of victory in World War II. But then by the 50s, it had sloughed itself out, had become the Commonwealth, and Britain is now a relatively small, you could say, politically, strategically unimportant country. Well, that happened to us. So, with that in mind, uh, here's just a statement in the middle of the page under Roman numeral 2. What is our constitution, our regime? Here's a one-sentence description of what our constitutional system is. Um, a complex channeling of indirect popular will into the rule of law and policies based upon popular majorities with broad civil and personal freedom. That's a pretty short one-sentence description of our Constitution, but that's what the founding brought into being. I think most of us would, even if we're critical of certain aspects of our political life, would say that that's what we aim at. That's what our system is. And so, with that in mind, Roman numeral 3 is the death of a nation. Now, as I mentioned on my notes, that's a play on D.W. Griffith's silent controversial film masterpiece, The Birth of a Nation. So, I'm going to suggest that there could be 7 things which could destroy the United States as we know it. Some of which we'll examine in this class, by the way, either cinematically or in terms of Ferguson's book. So one is catastrophe, natural, economic, social, pandemic, as in the great book about which Ferguson talks about, of course, with the great pandemics of history, Justinian's bubonic plague, the bubonic plague of Europe, although it left the nations of Europe more or less intact, even if 40 to 50% of the population died. Deep Impact, which is a comet strike on the Earth, and Old Faithful. Now, by that I mean, you understand that Old Faithful, the geyser in Yellowstone Park, is actually a super volcano waiting to happen. And if that, should that go off, like in the movie 2012, when everything that can go wrong, then probably the United States would be destroyed. Perhaps the pandemic. And by the way, I just finished uh, Alex Bearson, a reporter whom we're going to read later on in this class. He just came out with a new book called Pandemia, which argues that the pandemic has perhaps led to the collapse of the United States constitutional framework, but more about that later. Second, you could say a scientific catastrophe. And this is kind of in the last chapter, the scientific delusion. Um, and here, this is what we're exploring in nuclear war, but also if you've seen I Am Legend, or for that matter, the potential of a bioengineered pandemic that destroys humanity, you'll see something like that. Although that's not the premise in Contagion. But like Hiroshima, Nagasaki, or the day after, which we will watch about nuclear war in the United States. So some man-made catastrophe could overwhelm us. Third, war, and I laughingly or jokingly refer to that as the Canadians discover steroids, and Justin Trudeau leads a march on Washington and captures it. And we all have to learn how to drink beer and speak to polar bears. Um, but perhaps Putin refuses to yield in Ukraine and declares war on the United States. Perhaps China wants Taiwan that badly. We had a tendency to think because of the great world wars of the last century and because of the end of the Cold War, that war would not be the thing that would engulf us, but that may or may not be true. Fourth, civil war. Uh, uh, Lincoln, this terrible scourge of civil war. If you saw the movie V for Vendetta, one of the throwaway headlines in the background is um, in the former United States, civil war rages in the Midwest. Well, it is possible. Civil war happened once in our country, and if had it succeeded, we would still might have the United States of America, but it wouldn't be the country that we know. And if you like to read alternative history, there's a short book from 1957, I think, called "If the South Had Won the Civil War," in which there would the alternative history in which there are three nations: the United States of America, the Confederate States of America, and the Republic of Texas, which by the 1960s all amalgamate. So, but nevertheless, that's a possibility. Um, what about secession and the dissolution into smaller entities? Goodbye, Vermont, which has had a secessionist movement. Texas has had a secessionist movement. California now has had a secessionist movement. Even when I moved to South Carolina in 1986, there was even an academic movement called the League of the South, which advocated for secession of South Carolina. So that's a possibility. Perhaps the United States could break up for economic or other reasons, or cultural or political reasons. Sixth, disappearance into a larger entity. Now, here I quote from Star Trek: "To go boldly where no one has gone before." That is to say, the United States could be absorbed into some larger entity like world government, like the UN could become a world government, although would that be good or bad, who knows? But the premise of Star Trek, of course, is that Earth has been united and is now a member of the United Federation of Planets. Well, that could happen. And the last thing that might destroy the United States, as we know it, is a deformation or transformation of the regime into something else other than the constitutional system I described above. Uh, and again, that's where, uh, somewhat perhaps paranoidically, Alex Berenson suggests that the pandemic has begun to undermine the United States as a constitutional republic. So let me conclude with what are the real potential threats besides war, destruction, and catastrophe? The external threats. Well, there might be a technological, cultural threat to our republic from the fourth or larger element of the regime. And Neil Postman, who was a sociologist, wrote an interesting book in the 80s called "Amusing Ourselves to Death." That television, the internet, texting would so privatize and alienate our citizens from public life that we would become like some version of the People's Republic of China. Institutional collapse or deformation. And here you might say perhaps the corruption of the legislature or the deformation of the presidential race into a demagogic popular race, which kind of morphs into the last one, the growing divorce of popular will and institutional legal embodiment. that the idea that the presidential election could descend into a personality contest, which would overthrow the Constitution, as by the way has happened to most constitutional republics that have been overthrown by executive dictatorship. You start with a popular demagogue who then persuades the people that they need something other than the established constitutional order. So there you have it. There might be the potential sources of the death of the United States, treating the United States as one of the empires that Ferguson discusses at the end of chapter 6. So I hope you enjoy Contagion, and we'll see you next week. I'll discuss your papers on the Andromeda strain and also on Contagion, which you should have received the topic earlier today when we meet in class next Monday.